Today, we are going to talk about how to find this year's perfect zero RB running backs, from the profiles to the depth chart to everything that you need to know. And we're also going to tease an article that Shawn has coming out with the zero RB prep kit. And then obviously after that, we'll have the zero RB list coming. And then we will be here for week 1 of the NFL season, Shawn. It is going to be here very, very quick. But as we kick off this show Monday, the 15th of July, how are you doing? Are you really feeling like we're getting that step closer to the season? It feels like it's is it going to get overwhelming in a moment with so much fantasy drafts to work our way through?
I don't know, overwhelming. It's going to be very exciting with the amount of news that comes out once we get into training camp. Colm won't be able to finally really make some big rankings updates that don't come from people falling asleep at the wheel, that kind of thing, which rankings updates based on people playing football are a lot more fun. So can't wait for that. Colm, we also are going to be doing some really fun exercises here with the OT community in the short term. We've been working on the RotoViz Triflex setup. We have a bunch of people interested at a couple different price levels. And Colm, we're probably going to do the 250 first. We don't know for sure if we're going to have time or simply the logistics of doing the 100 level as well. And so both of those are, basically full. But if you're looking for the 251, again, let us know on that. And I think, Colm, we do maybe have someone interested in co-managing. So if you're thinking, I kind of prefer doing the 100, but if that doesn't go, I'd like to co-manage with somebody in the 250. Let us know. Co-managing, Colm, can be awesome. It can be infuriating. When you have the perfect pick and your co-manager really wants to trade down, if you're dealing with me, or you've got the perfect pick and your co-manager wants you to take a slow running back, there can be discussions. But a lot of the best teams that I've ever had a chance to be around, and a lot of the most fun discussions and the best in-season camaraderie comes from those co-managed teams. We're also going to do you sprung this on me this morning. You have a Superflex FFPC Best Ball Tournament draft almost filled for this Sunday. Colm, I guess since you're locked in co-manager, I am in. But if anybody else is thinking, don't fill it without me, let us know. Get to Colm right after this show releases. We've got a couple more spots there. Colm, you feel like this Sunday we're going to draft the tournament winning team?
That's what I hope, Shawn. The trouble is drafting against the RotoViz OT listeners is it's a tough proposition. It always builds out fun teams, fun drafts, but I'm looking forward to jumping into it. If people are interested, the plan is Sunday the 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern. That is the $35 Superflex contest over at the FFPC. I do send out the emails to people who have contacted me previously. Maybe if you have missed out on previous drafts, check your emails. Maybe I go into the spam folder. I don't know. But if you haven't reached out and you've thought about drafting against myself and Shawn, do reach out. You can send them my way on Twitter at OvertimeIreland or overtimeireland@gmail.com. I'll get those. If could be filled by the time you hear this, but if it's not, do reach out. And similar with the Triflex draft, we're looking to fill that $250 tier. There's a couple of potential openings, so get in touch on those same ways, and we're hoping to get both of those up and running over the course of the next week.
If they miss, but they reach out to you, they'll have the number 1 spot for the next draft. Is that right?
That is correct. That's the way we try to operate. I try and keep the details, reach out to people when things do come up. So let me know, overtimeireland@gmail.com or at overtimeireland. But Shawn, we've led the show off with a teaser of talking about zero running backs, prepping people to be able to find these candidates by themselves. And I've been fortunate enough, as I am at times doing these shows where Shawn shares some of the kind of stuff that's in the I'm not even going to do it. I was going to make some sort of an analogy, Shawn, about cooking and in the kitchen, but I made one of those recently and it did not work out on one of our live drafts. So I'm just going to park that to one side. We are going to look at what Shawn is looking at when we're looking through the players. And I am fortunate enough to be looking at an Excel spreadsheet at the moment with a lot of detail in it, We're going to work through some of that. But Shawn, again, we'd like to preference some of the Zero RB content by talking about the Zero RB element itself. What are some of your, I guess, broad views of Zero RB in 2024 versus other seasons? And I know that it's, you know, growing obviously and more popularity or more use consensus wise. But the thing that I always remind myself is like the amount of people who play fantasy and then the amount of people that we play with. We are kind of in a bubble of fantasy football players at the level we are. And when we expand that out further, there's still a lot of areas I think where Zero RB is not done correctly, tends to be my thought process around it. What are some of the kind of changes over the last couple of years that you've seen in Zero RB? And we always say this, but 2024 is another year I think could be just absolutely a smash spot for the strategy.
And so the first thing is trying to figure out, you know, where the tier breaks are before we dive into the specifics of player selection. Like, what would Zero RB be in 2024? And the ADP shifts, I don't think complicate is the right word. They accelerate some of these dynamics in very fun ways. You pull up the FFPC Best Ball Tournament right now, and you see that 30 wide receivers are selected through the 5-10. And then the next couple picks are Alvin Kamara and Kenneth Walker. In some other formats, you will get Kenneth Walker more or less like right at the edge of where the wide receiver cliff happens. So we did mention the Jordan Addison drunk driving issue at the beginning. His ADP will be interesting to see. I guess for me, the difference between his situation and Rice's situation is that with Rice, there appeared to be so much intentionality in terms of the criminality, kind of wanton disregard for other people, and then the fleeing of the scene. My thought in terms of how that relates to fantasy is that there probably would be more significant concerns from the legal community about some of the things that Rice did. But now with Addison, we have a second offense that is pretty disconcerting. So you look at, you know, where Rice is here compared to where he'd be going without the potential suspension concerns. I mean, you really can't apply the same type of penalty to Addison simply because his profile is already being drafted more or less at the cliff. And so you're going to have to push him, you know, well beyond where he would fit and where he fits kind of from a tactical perspective. It's not just within the ranking. So with Rice, there's been this huge penalty that's been applied. Partly that penalty results from the uncertainty, but it also is possible because you do have this receiver tier that stretches from where he would have been drafted, you know, probably in that, you know, wide receiver 13 to 18 range, stretches all the way down through about wide receiver 40. He's currently going at wide receiver 38. It's a different dilemma with Addison because you don't have a bunch of names that you can argue are vaguely similar that you can push him all the way down through. I just mentioned that because that's going to be about where the wide receiver cliff happens. And so when we're thinking about Zero RB, we're thinking about the underdog cliff coming approximately in the Kenneth Walker range there at running back 17, or an FFPC, the cliff really goes at about running back 29. So a substantial difference, right? These two formats are being played in very, very different ways. And that influences how we look at the types of profiles that you can get and the types of things that you're going for. But the article will start from the Kenneth Walker range if you're not drafting there with the emphasis, you can easily then skip the top names. But the thing that is interesting about the current dynamic is that you have the opportunity to draft 6 or 7 RB1s after the wide receiver cliff in Underdog. That's another reason why you would go ahead and do it that way. Why would you select running backs in the dead zone if you can get RB1s, and in many cases, interesting RB1s after the wide receiver cliff? Colm, that's the very first thing we're looking at. But then after we get through that part and kind of defining the terms for ourselves, we can start to look at the specific types of running back profiles that we really want.
Yeah, and I think you went through that very well, setting it up. And, Kenneth Walker, not just by a player that we like, but he has, throughout the entire draft season, felt like that potential first pivot point to the running backs that we like. And that's the way, obviously, it sets up as well by ADP. And as you've discussed there on both sides, some of the slight differences, but you have set it up by, and I think this is obviously important as well, the ADP by position, the RotoViz rank by position. That's going to give us some differentiations to it as well. But you've split it then into some of their special traits, or if they're special or not special. Then the offense are involved in running back slot on the depth chart. Are they a pass catcher? Have they standalone value? And then something I think that people overlook sometimes is, if the starter did get injured, are they in a committee or do they become the starter? And I think that's something that people tend to overlook a little bit too much when trying to look into some of these profiles. So, Shawn, from Kenneth Walker all the way down to basically where you get to the end of the running backs that are drafted, you've done that for all those players. That'll obviously feature into the article, but when you look at it, what way do you want to steer the conversation here as we kind of tease it out a little bit for some of these players, maybe some of these offenses, and then how you're diving into the profile as to if they are somebody that you truly want to be making sure that you're drafting or not drafting?
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned there, the RotoViz rank, if you pull up the FFPC exposures and ADP tool, one of the things that you will see when you look at the ADP is you can contrast the positional rank with our rankings, which are my rankings. That doesn't mean that my rankings are going to be more accurate, but it's going to give you a sense of where we see exploitable opportunities. Colm, let's dive into some of these profiles and perhaps start with this, maybe truer zero RB range in terms of what people are going to be, more traditionally thinking about, or things that they might be looking at in all drafts, which would include the FFPC drafts there. When we get into round 8, you still have JSN and Rome Odunze available, but it's obvious why you would have them available. Odunze, probably the wide receiver 3, at least to start the season. That's going to be a difficult spot from which to score a lot of fantasy points. JSN, he's going 3 rounds ahead of Tyler Lockett, so he is being priced as the wide receiver 2, but in a situation there where you have 3 potentially dynamic receivers with Geno Smith pulling the trigger, again, perhaps it'll be difficult to score. The middle of that 8th round is Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, Raheem Mostert, Zach Moss. These are pretty clearly moving into backs where you might consider them as into the true zero RB range. So when we're breaking down this group of players, we want to be thinking about how they move through the season and what happens when we get chaos. Because mostly what you're getting with ADP is you're getting week 1 scoring with a little bit of scenario-based drafting in the mix. Our argument would be that you want to be thinking more in terms of week 5 scoring, week 10 scoring, and certainly the fantasy playoff scoring. And so to get to that point and to make these decisions accurately, you need to know how they're going to move. So we have Warren and Harris side by side here in the middle of the 8th round. The first controversial thing is to compare these two players as talents. And when we do that, we get a very strong lean in the direction of Jaylen Warren. The interesting thing there, though, is that when I'm looking at backs who have less experience, someone who has the testing, the athletic dominance of a Najee Harris is going to look good, right? The other element that we have with Harris is peripherals that are actually pretty decent from a tackle breaking perspective. So I think then, we have to go to the second level of trying to decide what we mean, or if we mean different things about whether or not a running back is special at the very beginning of the zero RB window versus later on. Because one of the things that we see again in 2023 is that Najee Harris averaged 2.9 yards after contact per attempt. Those are really good numbers. He had a 14% broken tackle percentage. Those are really good numbers. Those are the reason that when people are talking about, well, who's going to be the 2023 Josh Jacobs? Who's going to be this guy that everybody looks at as a dead zone running back, but turns out to be the league winner? That's the reason people had Najee Harris as probably the leading contender. The problem for him is that even with those numbers, he averaged 4 yards per attempt, because Harris is uniquely capable of breaking, shouldn't say uniquely. There's some other backs who have some similar problems, like a Zach Moss, like a David Montgomery, where the broken tackle numbers are there. We know that there is an element of stickiness to that. We know that coaches love it when you break tackles. So that's going to give you this kind of anchor to stick and get touches. But the previous season, we again have a good broken tackle percentage from him, and he averages 3.7 yards per attempt. The year before that, again, double-digit broken tackles, good yards after contact, 3.9 yards per attempt. We have a very large sample of Najee Harris being able to break tackles and not gain yards. So at a certain point, I think that you have to put him into this group where, Najee Harris is not special. And you contrast that with his backfield mate, and Jaylen Warren led the NFL last year with a 30% evasion rate. He averaged 2.9 yards after contact, which gives him the same number as Harris, but he more than doubled Harris in yards before contact, and he had a broken tackle percentage above 20. So you're kind of looking at Warren as a player where if he plays to his floor, you're probably getting what Harris gives you if he plays to his ceiling. That's on a per touch perspective. He's also probably the better receiver, even though coming out of college, the fact that Harris had caught a bunch of passes in his last collegiate season was one of the things pushing him in that direction. Colm, drafters understand that Warren is the bigger talent. They also understand that Harris has been a first-round pick from the Steelers who hasn't been bad enough to completely go away. You might argue that it's a similar type of thing, even though it took Mark Ingram a long, long time to finally emerge. But Mark Ingram, disappointment for 3 seasons with the Saints, but they had traded up to take him in the first round. He sticks and eventually puts up big campaigns in the Sean Payton offense. That's why we have these two guys together, even though there is a talent gap. I think most people that tend to be kind of in the RV-ish community are on the Warren side, but Harris is hanging out in that same range for the reasons we mentioned, which are not completely inappropriate reasons, right? You can understand
I'm going
that.
to pitch this to you now, and you can say if this is completely wrong or not. But I feel like for most people who are probably listening to this show, what you're talking about stands out as what we would think. But I would imagine that most people in the consensus are looking at what these players, we kind of joke about it sometimes, but what these players have done so far. And Najee Harris comes in with the draft pedigree. He comes in with 3 years of what is production, but he is 255 yards or 255 attempts last year's his career low, but he has 307, 272, 255. And throughout his career so far, he has had 144 receptions. The reason I bring that up is I feel like Najee Harris is a dead zone running back being drafted in the 0 RB zone. So my pitch would be that drafters have got smarter and are not taking him in the 6th round. But the reasons for him going at this point are similar to if he was being drafted 4 rounds earlier. And I think that still makes him a big risk versus somebody like Warren, who we're talking about week 10 and who takes over this backfield. Do you think he's a dead zone back that's getting drafted 4 rounds later than he would have 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think that he is. And I think that drafters are simultaneously lifting Warren into this range that does actually get a little bit tricky because you're talking about someone who is in a committee. But one of the elements with Harris hanging out at the approximate same price is that when you look at last season, these guys had almost identical expected points numbers on a per game basis. And a lot of that is because Warren doubled Harris in receiving EP. So when we're talking about a guy who's rushing peripherals, his per play contribution as a runner were significantly better. And he also doubles him up in receiving the fantasy value of the receiving workload. Everything is skewed for you then in the direction of Warren, right? He also outperformed those numbers by about 1 per game, whereas Harris was right about even. When you look at it from that perspective, and Colm, I should say that when you include week 18, if fantasy managers are looking at that as well, obviously it wasn't a fantasy week, but it did happen. It is relevant for how you might look forward, that Harris has the edge in expected points, but that edge is neutralized by the disadvantage in fantasy points over expectation. Again, I think we're looking at 2 guys who project to similar workloads, and one has the ability to blow up as a star. The other one, probably the greater likelihood of being benched. But then as we move through the other elements for these guys, we have to decide what the offense is. Now, the Atlanta offense often gave big numbers in terms of the size of the pie. And so I have this labeled as poor. I'm obviously going to have to update that to reflect the total team running back expected points numbers. But my concern here is that you are going to have poor quarterback play. You don't have a lot of receiver talent. You don't have a lot of innovation and creativity from the offensive coordinator. Now, I do want to offset that by saying, even though he lacks some of the things that would probably launch the running game into the stratosphere, he is a competent run game designer, and there is that emphasis. We just talked about the size of the pie. So those things are probably going to offset to an extent. This is sort of above the range where we're probably that fixated on what happens if a starter gets hurt. But one of the reasons that you do like these guys who are in this committee here is that if one of them goes down, you would expect the other guy to get the vast majority of the workload. That's not necessarily the case in all of these other offenses that maybe are styled similarly. So that's something we want to keep in mind. Colm, move us down a little bit. Who stands out to you as an interesting case study as we're trying to think about the ceiling, the floor, who has contingent upside, who might be a target for us? and how these categories illuminate the different paths.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned this before, but some of the offenses that are, very tight, like the Steelers, like, even I know Shawn's not in on the Washington side of things, but Washington, the Browns, there's a lot of them mixed in there. But one of the areas, Shawn, that I think could be kind of interesting is looking at the running backs that, even with a starter getting injured, could go into a committee, and what that might mean for limiting their upside even in that scenario, and how that might progress them, moving into the season and having that league winning upside. One of those is Kendre Miller, and the other one is Jaylen Wright, and that leads to those two guys potentially starting off the season in part of a committee in the kind of best case scenario, but also then, even as the season goes on, how can they potentially break themselves out of that committee as well? And then when we look through some of their information in terms of Kendre Miller, for example, is he truly a pass catcher? And if in this situation Alvin Kamara goes down, does he get that work, which would obviously be a massive uptake in what he can do? But he also features in as somebody who has standalone value kicking the season off, and kind of on the opposite side then for Wright, he comes in as somebody who is a pass catcher, likely in a committee then if the starter or Mostert, who, like, you can say it's 1A, 1B in terms of who's the starter and who's not in that situation, but also doesn't really, because of that situation, have standalone value. And in terms of their ADP, those guys going off the board, within 4 running back picks off each other. I think working through some of their profile elements and then kind of the depth chart elements could be interesting to run through there. Which of them do you want to head on first? Do you want to head on the two of them simultaneously?
Yeah, so I think the area you've hit here is really interesting because we have a couple of second-year players and a couple of first-year players in this group.
I think this is the tier break where you go in, from Marshawn, Lloyd down, you start to go into like the players who are either have a strength in maybe one area or another, but not all areas, and also could land in a committee even in the best case scenario.
Yeah, so you have this interesting break from the running back 40 and the running back 41, where Gus Edwards and Ezekiel Elliott are the two clearest cases of a situation where you have a starter, but the starter is not special. And the ability there of the starter to hold the job in Elliott's case depends mostly on the fact that people also don't see the backup as being special. And the Chargers is probably a trickier version of that, where there are two backups who are interesting, but we have an injury situation and we have a youth situation to where it's not clear if the two backups are special in any way, shape, or form. That's obviously not a group that we're really looking at. But then the next group of Charbonnet, Lloyd, Miller, and then Dowdle and Chandler are in there. We can kind of skip them and go to Jaylen Wright, the player that you mentioned. 2 second-year players, 2 first-year players, and a variety of interesting offenses here. So Charbonnet, I think we can start with and say, from a special perspective, it's probably not. And yet the thing that people like about him is that he's high value touch capable, that his profile really leans in that direction. And I think it's controversial whether you would include that in the special category, but it is something that I reference for 3 or 4 backs because that high value touch element stands out so clearly. The offense, probably good. You have a lot of talent on the offense, and you have an interesting young offensive coordinator. Charbonnet is a pass catcher. He does have standalone value. And if Kenneth Walker goes down, you probably don't have a committee. And I think that's one of the things that you have to really be looking at with Charbonnet, where when we say probably don't have a committee, that doesn't mean that you're going to go out there and play 80% of the snaps. There are very few situations in the modern NFL where that happens. But when we're talking about a committee, we're talking about a substantial number of meaningful touches, high value touches that are taken by other guys because the backup doesn't separate from the third stringer. In the Charbonnet situation, you could have almost a pure committee to start with. And if that's the case, then the gap between Walker and Charbonnet is larger than it should be. So I like that. I think that offers a really good contrast to Marshawn Lloyd, who, with him, what we have in terms of special is we have plus athleticism and we have plus peripherals at the collegiate level. You look at the offense and it should be elite. He does catch some passes, although whether he emerged as a big pass catcher is probably something that you wouldn't get. He does have standalone value. But the problem there, and Colm, you can probably talk about this a little bit in a little bit more detail, but I think that Lloyd versus Miller is interesting in part because when we're playing these two offenses, I think what we're looking for is a dynamic where if you don't have Josh Jacobs, if you don't have Alvin Kamara, that you also don't have a real committee. Now, A.J. Dillon and Jamal Williams are going to play some, but again, not really in that committee dynamic, more simply as taking some touches. What are your thoughts on those two situations in terms of the kind of the third stringer who is a former meaningful name, but doesn't seem like a meaningful name now, not really being drafted in fantasy? How much weight should we give to the third string back in these two offenses?
I think that you give a little bit of weight based on, you never fully know what a team's going to do when they build these, depth charts out in the season and how they handle those carries. There's obviously questions coming in with a rookie and how much they involve him instantly in the Packers situation, whereas they have A.J. Dillon, who's been in the system for a number of years. But I think the drop-off and his play over the last couple of seasons has been, quite startling. And I think that there's a wide open door for Lloyd to push his way clearly into that second spot. The news, coming out of the Packers, like you would expect over the last couple of months, has been very positive on both Lloyd and their new recruit and Josh Jacobs. But I feel like Lloyd has the potential here to really push his way into a split between him and Jacobs. And then if it's a case that the starter, which I would perceive at this point to be Josh Jacobs, goes down, I think that he would lead the way. But being a rookie, I could see the Packers try to split that out between him and Dillon, even in that situation, rather than give him all the work. But with the upside of his profile, I think he can, at that point, let's say that's week 6, week 7, week 8, I think he can push himself in to be the all-out starter there. And I can see it in a very similar way. I think they're very interesting players to pair together at that point of ADP, but also on your rosters. I think they both have the upside to be the starter of these offenses. I don't think we'll see Lloyd come in and, push Jacobs to the side where that changes without injury. But I could see a situation as the season approaches here and gets underway where Kendre Miller pushes himself ahead of Alvin Kamara. We know some of the situations then with the Saints, and you mix in Taysom Hill and things like that, and there's some limited upside around the goal line for the running backs. But I could see out of these two, Miller usurping Kamara, naturally as the process progresses here and into the season, because we've seen Kamara have some struggles in efficiency over the last couple of seasons as well, whereas the Packers are going to want to implement the running back that they've acquired in free agency to start things off here.
And so for me, kind of what you articulating there is an interesting difference in that I think you can be more confident, more comfortable that Marshawn Lloyd is going to have committee value than you can in Kendre Miller. But with Miller, you have a back where, as you mentioned, he could potentially earn the sort of nominal RB1 position on that team, even if Kamara stays, which I know is going to be hard for a lot of people to believe or internalize because Kamara has been such a big name, but he also is in a large stretch of touches where he hasn't been, he has not been a difference maker. The other part there is that Lloyd, despite this athleticism, despite the fantastic peripherals, never got a big workload in college. And that includes two different situations, 2022 and 2023. The contrast there with Kendre Miller, who carried 224 times and averaged 99.9-ish yards per game. He finished 1 yard shy of averaging 100 rushing yards per game. And then he did add over 100 receiving yards. He wasn't hugely involved as a receiver, in part because he had such a big rushing role there in his final season at TCU, which did happen as a very young player. I mean, Kendre Miller, despite having his rookie year wash out, is still younger than a huge number of the guys who came into the league this year. That's something to kind of keep in mind also. So Miller's background with that big 2022 workload and the fact that Jamal Williams is probably even more just a guy than A.J. Dillon, I think that Miller has the better chance at seeing a huge workload in the 2024 season, even if his straightforward standalone value in week one is probably less than what the rookie has. So you want to be thinking through those dynamics, trying to figure out which ones fit best with your own preferences and risk comfort, which ones fit best with the players you've already drafted or the players that you plan to draft, that you have as targets later. Colm, Jaylen Wright, just to kind of wrap that through, we have the 93rd percentile freak score from him. You're in an elite offense. You have pass catching ability. But the concern there would be that at the beginning of the year, probably not a ton of standalone value with the 2 stars ahead of you. And if a starter goes down, you don't have some massive bump to star status. What you have is this big bump into a committee. And so you have to think through how well that type of profile fits again with your overall roster.
And then the other part we didn't really talk that much about overall, but then you try to balance that out with the fact that he may be in the best offense in the NFL. So even if he's on the 2-man committee, trying to balance that upside out with the other guys and their offenses. I know we'll say the Packers are probably creeping up towards that, but versus the Saints, for example, it's another wrinkle to balance in towards it.
Definitely. And so with Jaylen Wright, you're thinking the upside is the highest. The path to get there is the narrowest. Again, how does that fit with the other things that I'm trying to accomplish on this roster? Colm, let's take it down to some of the names at the bottom of the draft here, where we have controversial, interesting, provocative names like Dameon Pierce, Will Shipley, Trey Sermon, 3 very different circumstances.
Yeah, and I know, we can preference this. We get... I'm enjoying on Stealing Bananas. We get the kind of Will Shipley and Brock Bowers as kind of the 2 auto picks in a lot of these drafts that Shawn and Ben are doing together. You get Shipley, obviously, in just a fantastic offense, fantastic situation with strong athleticism coming in. But the deeper we get down, again, you talked a moment ago about some of the paths and how that can happen. I do feel like although there is other running backs in the situation in Philadelphia, and he may be starting this off as potentially the running back 3, but I think him working his way in as the running back 2, and then obviously the upside of that offense should something happen to Saquon Barkley is huge. The one part that has been difficult in the Jalen Hurts offense is, you're looking at him getting the work in close to the goal line. We get the tush push. It will be interesting to see how that develops this year with Kelsey retiring as well, if it is as effective, and maybe that is something that opens it up a little bit more towards the running backs as well. But when we get into this area of the draft, he is somebody that I'm trying to get on as many of the rosters as I can with the 0 RB or non-0 RB rosters. I think just when we look at the gaps in ADP for the running backs and the potential upside for them, he really stands out in this particular area of drafts as somebody that you really want to have in there. The one that you mentioned, Shawn, is Trey Sermon. That was something that actually came up in a YouTube comment recently, looking about drafting Trey Sermon, as a deep sleeper in best ball drafts, the commenter did mention as well that more people are on Hull for the backup role, but they were kind of leaning towards Trey Sermon. I think when we start to get down to this point of the draft, obviously ADP becomes less of a factor, but he would be the Hull side of that listener would be correct, and so that would be the way that I would lean between them. But Guerendo, again, when we look at large splits between the potential running back one in that offense and then the guys in behind that, I think the athleticism obviously that we've seen from him is tremendous. But you have marked here, and I'm interested to hear your case on it, that there may be standalone value. That is that down to the offense itself, and that could just provide opportunities for multiple people, or do you expect him to have a standalone role early in the season or as the season goes on? I guess you are going to have people that are going to have to spell Christian McCaffrey for certain portions of games, but I find that it might be a little bit tricky to see him, have weeks in the early season where the points totals are, whether that's in best ball or in redraft formats.
Well, I have maybe for Guerendo because I don't think that we know. And that's the thing right now when fantasy managers are drafting based on the depth chart. I think you're likely to make a lot of mistakes. So we have someone in Elijah Mitchell who is good, not great, someone who is constantly injured. And then you add, maybe the most athletic back in the class to the roster and someone who, despite being a big back, is a plus receiver. So you think about how do we replicate some of the things that Christian McCaffrey does. They've talked about trying to limit his workload a little bit. That's something that's easy to say in the offseason. Once you get into these games and you're trying to make sure that you win them, he is obviously going to play a lot. There have been a few, really weird situations late in games that they've had one where they were playing McCaffrey. Yeah. And so the path to limiting him, as they've been mentioning, is open. You just wonder if they will have the discipline to actually do it. But thinking through whether or not Guerendo has standalone value is one of the things I think that managers need to be doing. And why make that pick on an offense that has such a large pie and is so dynamic and has had all of these running backs come out of nowhere? The situation with Elijah Mitchell himself is one that is perhaps instructive in that they had drafted Trey Sermon, in theory to be the guy, but the gap between those two guys was so severe that Sermon ends up doing nothing, eventually moves to the Indianapolis Colts. And so that's one where I think that the Sermon example is interesting in that so many of the sharpest fantasy people that I interact with really like Sermon. And so they're probably right when you have a bunch of people who are very good at this and are picking out Sermon as an interesting player. But I just want to make the counter argument and at least let people, think through the other side of this, where we have a situation that fantasy managers are so skeptical of what the running back context is going to be that Jonathan Taylor is not going in the first round. Right? You've got the guy who's a former 101, who is the best big play back in football, who is going to be in this offense where his per play efficiency is likely juiced by the fact that you have Anthony Richardson and what the hybrid QB does for the running back in that situation. And yet, because of the goal line problems and because of the likely lack of passing volume to the backs, we have Jonathan Taylor going in the second round. If you have Jonathan Taylor going in the second round, why would you want anybody else on this team? And why would you want someone in Trey Sermon who is not special? Now, I say that we don't really have any examples of him playing at the NFL level. And as a result of that, maybe all of the teams that he's played on previously have been wrong, right? Maybe he should have played on those 49ers teams. Maybe he should have been the guy instead of Zach Moss last season. But you have a player who moved off of Oklahoma because of the concern that Ramondre Stevenson would cover him up. You have a guy who goes and plays on a ridiculously good Ohio State team and scores 4 rushing touchdowns. Right now, he didn't play a full season that year, so we have to keep that in context as well. He did average over 7 yards per attempt. He is someone who has a good vertical, but the overall size athleticism profile is kind of in this dead zone backish type of range. And you would probably argue that it's one of the reasons that he didn't originally succeed with the 49ers. Now, players can stick in the league and they can emerge down the line. Another back who is somewhat controversial in this kind of area of drafts, who you might put in that same category, would be a Deontay Foreman. Now, Foreman is a player who the size speed profile was on the elite side, so a little bit different there. So I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but we look at what Trey Sermon has done. We look at what the offensive context is, and then you look at some of the people that he's competing with, where Mike Goodson was decent, but Evan Hall was injured last year. And Hall is somebody who the sub 4.5 40, you have a 37-inch vertical, you have a sub 7 3-cone. You have an athletic back who in his final season at Northwestern caught 55 passes. In his last 2 years, 87 receptions. So one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that if you have an injury to Jonathan Taylor, you probably have a committee between Sermon as the grinder and Hall as the receiving back. As you're thinking through that, Hall doesn't become very appealing because running back targets in this offense will not be that high. And yet it's still an issue for Sermon as well, because even to get this mild bump as a receiver, he's covered up. We work through those different things, and when you're talking about a contingent late round pick, Sermon to me is not interesting. He doesn't really check any of these boxes that we're looking for, and I do think that he's right now being boosted. And you say boosted, it's a last round pick, so people are not having to pay much, and that's one of the reasons that he is being drafted, is like it's the last round, right? We're not having to overinvest. But the part that I think is pushing him is that a lot of fantasy managers are thinking about what happened last year with Zach Moss and assuming that you get that same dynamic if Taylor is out with Trey Sermon. But the biggest mistake that I tend to see drafters make over the last decade with Zero RB is to overdraft a handcuff in a situation where that handcuff, either the same guy or someone in that offense, had done well the previous season, but the previous season's result relied on a very specific type of outcome, which in part it relied on the starter getting hurt, or in the case with the Colts being out because of injury / contract negotiation elements there. It's always a mistake to draft a handcuff because that handcuff paid off the year before if you don't also like the profile. And the thing that I would mention with Sermon is because Zach Moss was somewhat unsuccessful, and many people say was wildly unsuccessful with the Bills, he's looked at as not being special. And I would probably put him in that not special category. But the thing to remember is that similar to Najee Harris, he had these very strong broken tackle peripherals, even as he failed otherwise with the Bills. We don't even have that with Sermon. It's likely that Zach Moss is quite a bit better than Trey Sermon. I say likely because, again, we don't know for sure. But I think pattern matching to a situation that happened last year when Richardson barely played because of injury and Moss played well, in part because he had the immediate opportunity. You didn't need that injury to somebody else that you need now with Sermon. It just makes these two very different contexts and situations to me, to where there are other guys that I would prefer in round 18. That's working through the exercise. It's thinking through what you need to have happen. It's looking at the profile of the back column again. So many very sharp people are on Trey Sermon that I would encourage you to listen to them and to lean into that part of it. But I think he's a good example of what we're doing with the exercise that would give us some concern.
That's all very good stuff. So we are going to leave it there. As I mentioned, there will be an article coming out in the very near future on rotoviz.com. You'll be able to check out all of Shawn's thoughts on it there with more details added in. If you are interested, as we mentioned at the start, in playing in that Triflex Dynasty League with us at $250 entry level or the $35 FFP Superflex contest, do get in touch at overtimeireland@gmail.com or on Twitter at overtimeireland. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter, as I mentioned there, at overtimeireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.